How's it going, guys? It's Eclipse here, and today we are looking at ammunition and its use on World of Tanks console. So, what exactly is ammunition? Obviously, it's the thing you fire out of your tank. Without it, you're not going to be doing any damage. When used wrong, you're not going to be doing any damage either. So that's why it's very important to be able to pick the right ammunition for the job, and we're going to go over exactly why you'll need different ammunition types and what the effectiveness is of the ammunition. So first things first, let's pick something like a medium, because they're pretty much general. They're like a standard penetration model. Heavies tend to have similar penetration, and light tanks having less, but we'll go into the different tank types and what you should probably be using on the various ones in just a second. So we'll pick the Huntsman, since everyone who completed last season will have got it. So what is penetration like on this tank? If you want to check the penetration, what you do is you go from the garage and you pick on the tank that you want to have a look at, and then you press X. This will give you the a kind of upgrade tab and customization type tab that will allow you to see exactly what the sort of thing you can look at. So penetration on the Huntsman, if you look up in the top right hand corner where the box is, and it says penetration, and it goes 226/258/42. Now the first value corresponds to the first set of damage on the damage one below. So your first ammunition type, which on the Huntsman is AP, will have 226mm of penetration, which is what is important for going through the armour of tanks that you're going to be coming up against. So let's back out, and I'll kind of show you exactly what I mean. So if we go to the Eradicator and we go to the armour viewer, if you see on the front plate there, if you have a look, the lower plate of the Eradicator is 76mm. Now it's angled, so it's not flat, as you can see, which increases the armor value probably to something like 110, something like that, which is pretty weak anyway. But if you take your first penetration value, because it's similar on the Eradicator, let's take this as the example actually, because we can talk about it penning itself, like if you met the same tank coming up against itself. So 220mm, that's going to be able to go through the lower plate of this thing. Then we've got 95mm on the back of the turret, which isn't angled, so it's probably actually worse armour than the lower plate here. And then we've got 111mm here, and then a cupola. The upper plate is 130mm thick, that's angled, so it's probably about 160. And then you've got the really well armoured parts of the tank here. Now, it does have spaced armour around it, but if you look right now on screen on these cheek bits that are highlighted in red, they're 203mm. Now, if I'm firing my standard round, which is the first one, 220mm of penetration, I might be able to go through it, but it does have that spaced armour, and it's also a fact of, if we hit that and it's slightly angled, it's going to bounce. So it's all about reducing the likelihood of you bouncing, which is going to make you do more damage in games, which is something that you obviously want to be doing, otherwise why are you even watching this video? Because if you want to get better, that's the sort of things you need to do. Increase your likelihood of being able to do more damage, or being able to spot more, or being able to track more. So if we then pick the second round, which is the 252mm, you'll more than likely be able to go through that. It's annoying because this has spaced armour on the front, so that's not particularly great as an example. But say if it was flat and the spaced armour, which is that little like plate that kind of is off of the tank, then we'd be able to go through this far more reliably with the 252mm of penetration. Additionally, you do actually get a 25% RNG on the roll of your penetration. So, say if you do 100 millimeters of penetration, as an example, you can low roll to as much as 75 millimeters of penetration, but you could also high roll to 125 millimeters of penetration. So it's similar to the damage in the terms of how much damage you can do, because you can high roll on your pen or low roll on your pen. So obviously if you pick the higher penetration, it doesn't suffer anything else. So, it's just flat out better. And a lot of the time it has an increased shell velocity, which is the speed at which your round will actually hit the enemy tank. So that's good for if someone's trying to get away from you, and it will hit them faster, and it means you don't have to give as much lead when you're shooting at opponents. So getting back to the 252, that 50mm, that 32mm extra penetration on your premium rounds will pretty much be the same as negating your low roll on the pen. So do you know what I mean? It's like, it's just a buff basically. So if you fire premium rounds, you're going to be able to do more damage more consistently should you need the premium round. And this is what I mean. So yes, the Eradicator, you might need premium rounds for the turret if it's hold down and you try and shoot the mantlet. But say if we came up against an Excalibur, are we going to need premium rounds of like 200mm? Absolutely not, considering if you look at the front of this thing, it's got 40mm, it's got 45mm on the lower plate and 50mm at the upper plate and various different parts of the tank. The side of it has 25mm. So what's going on here? Why would we need premium rounds? Well, you wouldn't necessarily need premium rounds, and because of the armor, because it's got 45 at the front and 25 at the side. Well, this is where you can start using your other rounds, which are the HE rounds, these, or Hesh, which have lower penetration, but they do more damage. So although it says it does more damage, on average you'll probably do less, because if you come up against a tank that has armor, you're not going to be able to do any damage to them. So don't just pick the round that has the most damage, because it won't have the most damage overall. You're better off actually using the lower damage but higher penetration in most cases, unless you come up against tanks that have really low armor and your penetration is high enough to go through them. Like, for example, if I found a Firefly VC in game, and I was in a fairly heavily armored tank, then if I got the flat side of it, it's got 38mm of armor, not particularly great. I could pen it with HE. If I was in the same tank and I normal rolled on my penetration with HE, I would be able to pen it. So is it worth it? Is that 40 extra damage, if you can see on the top right, is it worth me risking getting very little damage? So I might do an extra 40 damage, or I could do 20 damage if it doesn't pen. So is it worth risking the 130 damage for the sake of gaining the extra 40 damage? If you know that it's going to pen, then 100% is worth it. You should be doing that. But as a general rule, I would not really recommend firing HE, which is your third round generally on your tank. So I definitely wouldn't recommend that. Another thing that you should note is that tanks like the British tier 10s, if we just go to them right now, the tier 10 mediums, where is it? There it is. So the FV4202, for example, if we go to its rounds and we have a look, it gets Hesh rounds. Now, what's a Hesh round? It's a round where you get less penetration than your standard round, but it's not to a point where it's doing that much less penetration. So it's kind of like, on this tank, for example, the 268 is pretty much enough to go through any tank in the game, so long as you know the weak spots, at least. And then 210mm, it's kind of like if I come up against a tank that's perhaps a couple tiers below me or a tier below, or if I know the weak spots of a tank at the same tier, then I'll be able to, that has 210mm or less armor in that weak spot, then you'll be able to pen. So that's fantastic, because you can do more damage, as you can see, 90 extra damage per shot with this Hesh round. And that's fantastic for actually being able to, increase the amount of damage you're doing per shot, and it doesn't take any extra reload. It takes the exact same time, and obviously you just do more damage with less penetration. So now that we've kind of gone over the different types of rounds, that's pretty much all of them in the game. You do have heat rounds, which are more effective against flat armor and things like, type 4 heavies, type 5 heavies, where the armor's really flat. And APCR rounds are just generally good at anything, although they do lose penetration over distance. So if a tank is really far away from you, that's not particularly great for APCR rounds, and it's going to be a problem for shooting at something potentially way outside your view range, and it's just in your render range. So what would I recommend? If we have a look on Tanks GG, which I will do in just a second. So here we are on Tanks GG, which is really good for picking kind of whether your rounds are going to be effective or not. So say if we're in an E100, as you can see, if we fire a heat round, you've got a higher percentage chance to go through the lower plate of the enemy E100. Whereas if you fire an AP, you've got less of a chance. And that's down to the RNG, like we've mentioned. But additionally, if you look at the turret, since we've got a very little chance, and then we load a heat round, we've got a 60% chance. So you're more than likely to go through this this turret of the enemy E100 if you load heat. The problem with heat rounds is that if you shoot at spaced armor, it's particularly not good whatsoever. So heat rounds are not good against spaced armor. They're particularly bad against that. They're better against flat armor or armor that isn't angled very well. And even if a tank is armored, like angled, because of the higher penetration, you generally will probably be more likely to go through an armored tank with heat rounds anyway, just because they tend to have like that much more penetration, as you see, getting an extra 90 on the E100. And then HE rounds, you're just going to bounce, you're not going to do any damage. It's just, you're never going to pen yourself with 85mm of penetration. Even in the bum, you're not going to actually be able to do that. And even from above, like if it's angled at all, you're not going to be able to pen. So it's all about determining whether your round is best for the opponent. If I'm firing AP, I'm against an enemy 100, I'm probably going to start loading the heat, because, do I want to bounce more likely? Do I want to have a more likely chance to bounce? Or do I want to literally press A in game and be able to go through the front of the enemy 100 that much more? Twice as likely to go through the enemy 100. Obviously, you're going to pick your better chances, and it does come at a cost. So if we swap back to the console now, and we have a look at console, so the cost of rounds is obviously dependent on the tank, and it's really whether you think it's viable to fire that premium round. If you're struck on money, then it's not the worst case in the world to fire a couple rounds of premium, because they don't cost an absolute fortune, not really, but they do cost. If you're firing just premium rounds, then you're going to lose a lot of money every game, and it's not something I would ever recommend. It's just there for when you need to pen and you don't have at all, you don't want to risk it at all. And if you're firing at a light tank, you do not need heat, you do not need APCR, you just need your standard round. and you know, saving 4,000 silver every single shot is definitely worth it. Now, I do want to mention though that if you're in something like an autoloader, it's important to understand that, you know, if you're going to load a round, then you're loading 3 rounds. So if you're in something like a TVP, do not ever take HE rounds. Don't ever take them. They are never ever worth taking, unless, well, no, because the opportunity for you to be able to come up against something like an enemy waffle at the end of the game, where you're not going to meet any other tanks on the opposite team, just to do an extra, you know, 400 damage to them, and you're probably not going to be able to unload your full clip because your team are probably going to be there. So yeah, I would never ever take HE rounds in your autoloaders, just because the increase in damage is not worth the decrease in what you can shoot with HE. Because if you load a full clip and the waffle's decided he's just going to run away from only you and he's just going to YOLO into your teammates, and you're stuck there after reloading for 30 seconds to be able to deal damage to the waffle, and now an E100 comes around the corner to deal with you and you've only got HE, then it's not worth it. Do you know what I mean? It's not just a case of a couple of seconds reload where, you know, you've missed out on damage, but it's actually 30 seconds. So never ever take, in my opinion, take HE rounds in your autoloaders, especially ones that have a long reload to begin with. So yeah, I always take probably a proportion of about a third premium rounds in my tanks. You can see here on the TVP, I've got about a third of the rounds. And then if we, you know, pick the 140, yet again, we've got a ratio of about a third nearly. I do take a couple of HE rounds in my 140, and generally on most single shot guns, I will take HE rounds, just because a lot of the time, if you come up against artillery, it's actually really useful, because if you're firing at an artillery which has no armor pretty much, you'll be able to pen, and therefore you can usually actually take them out in one shot. If you've got like a 440 alpha gun and you come up against a T92, then you can take them out in one shot usually, and that's tier 10 artillery. If you've coming up against tier 9 and tier 8, you can one-shot them quite reliably with HE, with most tanks, depending on how much extra damage those HE rounds will do. So yeah, I would 100% be looking into ammunition and when you should use it in game. I know this video has probably been quite a lot of kind of talking, and I hope I've kind of explained when you should use the different rounds. I know it's quite a big thing when you first play this game and you think, oh, the HE rounds, they do more damage, so I'm going to be doing more damage in game, but that is not the case. They only do more damage when they're used correctly, and that is against really lightly armoured tanks or artillery. And if you get around the back of certain tanks, you can fire HE because the armour's just that weak. And then we'll just look over one more example. So if we look at the T20, the back of the T20 is probably going to have not a lot of armour. So yeah, as you can see, 38mm of armour at the back of the T20. So with most HE rounds, you can go through the back of it with HE. So it kind of, you know, as you get better, you'll be able to decide whether your HE round's going to go through the back of certain tanks, and you'll get used to knowing what tanks have good armour, what don't. And that's the thing, as you learn the game, you'll learn what tanks have what weak spots, whether my round's going to usually pen, and that's the thing that you need to figure out yourself as you get through. But I hope I've kind of gone over the rounds and what they're good and what they're useful for, how much they cost, when you should use them, what the damage figures are, whether the increase in penetration is worth it, and I hope that kind of gave you a bit of an insight into how I use my premium rounds in game. And I don't tend to actually fire loads and loads of premium rounds in my tanks, only when I'm in those situations where you need to pen, that I will use them quite a bit. I hope you guys have enjoyed the video, found it informative, or just generally found it, you know, interesting to watch and kind of hear my opinion. And I hope you guys kind of take some of this tips and tricks that I've kind of shown you with the ammunition to be able to put them into your own game. I will try and use the ammunition types in my videos as to kind of explain how I'm using and what my selection is at different points, but that won't be a whole video on its own. It will kind of be mixed in within my videos, so as you watch you'll be able to learn a few different things to kind of get better at the game. At least I hope so, as part of this video, and also future videos on gameplay and guides and stuff like that. I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did, once again, hit that like button, and if you want to see some more stuff which is on screen right now, then subscribe, and also just click on them if you feel like you want to, if they interest you. If not, I hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.